Chapter 2. Other falsities. Section 1. Usurpation of authority, rank, title, and improper use of names, uniforms and insignia. Article 177. Usurpation of authority or official functions. Any person who shall knowingly and falsely represent himself to be an officer, agent or representative of any department or agency of the Philippine government or of any foreign government, or who, under pretense of official position, shall perform any act pertaining to any person in authority or public officer of the Philippine government or any foreign government, or any agency thereof, without being lawfully entitled to do so, shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods. Article 178. Using fictitious name and concealing true name. The penalty of arresto mayor and a fine not to exceed 500 pesos shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly use a fictitious name for the purpose of concealing a crime, evading the execution of a judgment or causing damage. Any person who conceals his true name and other personal circumstances shall be punished by arresto mayor or a fine not to exceed 200 pesos. Article 179. Illegal use of uniforms or insignia. The penalty of arresto mayor shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly and improperly make use of insignia, uniforms or dress pertaining to an office not held by such person or to a class of persons of which he is not a member. Section 2. False testimony. Article 180. False testimony against a defendant. Any person who shall give false testimony against the defendant in any criminal case shall suffer 1. The penalty of reclusion temporal, if the defendant in said case shall have been sentenced to death. 2. The penalty of prison mayor, if the defendant shall have been sentenced to reclusion temporal or reclusion perpetua. 3. The penalty of prison correctional, if the defendant shall have been sentenced to any other afflictive penalty, and 4. The penalty of arresto mayor, if the defendant shall have been sentenced to a correctional penalty or a fine, or shall have been acquitted. In cases provided in subdivisions 3 and 4 of this article, the offender shall further suffer a fine not to exceed 1,000 pesos. Article 181. False testimony favorable to the defendants. Any person who shall give false testimony in favor of the defendant in a criminal case shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor in its maximum period to prison correctional in its minimum period, a fine not to exceed 1,000 pesos, if the prosecution is for a felony punishable by an afflictive penalty, and the penalty of arresto mayor in any other case. Article 182. False testimony in civil cases. Any person found guilty of false testimony in a civil case shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum period and a fine not to exceed 6,000 pesos, if the amount in controversy shall exceed 5,000 pesos, and the penalty of arresto mayor in its maximum period to prison correctional in its minimum period and a fine not to exceed 1,000 pesos, if the amount in controversy shall not exceed said amount or cannot be estimated. Article 183. False testimony in other cases and perjury in solemn affirmation. The penalty of arresto mayor in its maximum period to prison correctional in its minimum period shall be imposed upon any person who knowingly makes untruthful statements and, not being included in the provisions of the next preceding articles, shall testify under oath, or make an affidavit, upon any material matter before a competent person authorized to administer an oath in cases in which the law so requires. Any person who, in case of a solemn affirmation made in lieu of an oath, shall commit any of the falsehoods mentioned in this and the 3 preceding articles of this section, shall suffer the respective penalties provided therein. Article 184. Offering false testimony in evidence. Any person who shall knowingly offer in evidence a false witness or testimony in any judicial or official proceeding, shall be punished as guilty of false testimony and shall suffer the respective penalties provided in this section.